if you are in South Africa, and to all our international participants as well, wherever in the world you may be. Welcome to this lecture hosted by the International Students of Islamic Psychology, Southern Africa. Just to run through tonight's proceedings, inshallah. The title of tonight's lecture is Mental Health with a Special Feature on Community Work in Gaza, Palestine. And our guest lecturer tonight is Professor Ashraf Kaji from the University of Stellenbosch in South Africa. This lecture will be moderated by Sisters Shireen Ismail and Safia Bobat and myself, Wahbi Long. And before we begin with an introduction of Professor Kaji, I'll begin with the customary act in our events, which is an opening dua. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ala ali Muhammad wa sahbihi wa barik wa sallim. Allahumma ja'al jam'ana hadha jam'an marhuma wa tafarruqana min ba'dihi tafarruqan ma'suma wa la taj'al Allahumma fina wa la ma'ana ولا من يتبعنا شقيا ولا محروما ولا مطرودا ربنا لا تؤاخذنا إن نسينا أو أخطأنا ربنا ولا تحمل علينا إصرا كما حملته على الذين من قبلنا ربنا ولا تحملنا ما لا طاقة لنا به واعف عنا واغفر لنا وارحمنا أنت مولانا فانصرنا على القوم الكافرين ربنا زدنا علما ربنا زدنا علما ربنا زدنا علما سبحان ربك رب العزة عما يصفون سلام على المرسلين والحمد لله رب العالمين. I'll begin with a brief introduction of ISIP SA, inshallah, and some guidelines in terms of how to participate in tonight's lecture. I'll then introduce our guest, Professor Ashraf Kaji. There will be a Q&A session afterwards, and then we will wrap things up, inshallah. So, to all the guests tonight, in terms of Zoom etiquette, please keep your microphones on mute when you're not speaking. Also, I would like to request no recordings or screenshots. But whilst Professor Kaji is speaking, please do go ahead and type all your questions in the chat. The moderators will be keeping track of the chat room, and we will get to ask at least a selection of the questions in the Q&A. At the end, inshallah. Just to revisit ISIP's mission statement, ISIP is an inclusive space designed to connect people with diverse backgrounds interested in Islamic psychology. ISIP aims to disseminate knowledge, share resources, and discuss best practice in a free and accessible manner. And ISIP is also a platform to enable further development of people's personal and professional interests, studies, and understanding of Islamic psychology within their communities and or countries of origin. Please do subscribe to ISIP's YouTube channel, join the Islamic Psychology Southern Africa WhatsApp group, where Islamic psychology resources and events are shared and open to anyone interested in Islamic psych. And please do become a member of the ISIP via the website www.isip.foundation, where you can get access to the digital library that literally has thousands of resources. I now want to just take a moment to introduce our guest speaker, the esteemed Professor Ashraf Kaji, a psychologist, an academic, an author who has studied in both South Africa and abroad in the States. He is Professor of Psychology at Stellenbosch University. He serves on the Board of Trustees at the Trauma Center for Survivors of Violence and Torture in Cape Town. He does capacity building work at the Community Mental Health Center in Gaza, Palestine. And in his spare time, he is an award-winning author. Professor Kaji's first novel, Khalil's Journey, won the European Union's Literary Award back in 2012 and the South African Literary Award in 2013. By the Fading Light is Professor Kaji's second novel, which, if I'm not mistaken, came out last year in 2021. Please also, colleagues, just in terms of an upcoming session, please do save this date, November the 25th, Friday night. A very interesting lecture, which I'm sure many in the audience as practitioners will be curious about. It's a talk on the challenges that Muslim youth experience while studying hifz, memorization of the Quran, offering a psychological perspective on those challenges. I'm now going to hand over to Professor Kaji. Professor Kaji, again, shukran kathiran for joining us tonight, for taking time to spend with us to share your thoughts and insights on what looks to be a very interesting topic that I'm sure many in the audience are very eager to hear you speak on. Thanks again for joining us, and I'll hand over to you now. I'll switch off my camera as well.
Okay, thank you very much, Wahbi. And thank you very much to Shireen and Safia and to ISIP for the invitation to speak this evening. It's really a great honor for me to be with you and to share with you some of the challenges, issues, concerns, and also successes of the work of the Gaza Community Mental Health Program, where I've been involved over the past few years. So I've got a set of slides which I'm going to share. If I can just get the technology to work. Okay, there we go. Okay, can I just get an indication about whether the slides are visible, please?
Perfect, Professor. It's looking good.
All right, good. So the topic of my talk is mental health and human rights in Gaza. And I don't think I need to tell this audience about the events that have taken place in Palestine over the past several decades, leading to the current situation in Gaza. So what I want to talk about are some of my observations about the living conditions in Gaza. I want to talk about the work of the Gaza Community Mental Health Center. And I want to talk about some of the work that I've been doing in terms of capacity building, in terms of strengthening psychological services and contributing to the efforts of this very important nonprofit organization that is doing this work in the Gaza community. This is a picture of Palestinian land. This on the far, on my left, would be what happened in 1917, and the white there is Palestinian land, and you can see today that Palestinian land has been encroached on by Israel to an extent that these fragments of land that are now available for Palestinians to claim. You can see that this is a very, very serious human rights set of violations that have taken place over the past several decades. And in that corner there is Gaza. I think everybody would know where that is. And I don't think I wanted to dwell too much on the horrors of this. You can see, you've been following the news over the past many years about the Israeli military attacks in Gaza. Essentially what I want to do is talk to you a little bit about what it's like to live there, what it's like to be there, what it's like for people to go through their day-to-day lives in Gaza, and call attention to some of the psychological issues, some of the issues related to the psychological life of people living in Gaza. Now, this picture, this map over here is a picture of Gaza, and right at the top, you can see it says Erez Crossing. And the Erez Crossing is how people from the international community enter Gaza. People from the international community, NGO workers, journalists, medical doctors, and in my case, as a psychologist, people usually fly into Ben Gurion Airport and then take a taxi to the Erez Crossing. And when you get to the Erez Crossing, there are three sets of barriers that one has to encounter. The first is the Israeli border, the Israel border, and one has to have a permit in order to cross from Israel into Gaza. And then the Fatah people, they want to see your papers, and then the Hamas people. And after those three groups of officials have been dealt with, one is able to then enter into Gaza. Now, it has to be said that on many occasions, people's permits do not get granted, and many people cannot travel into Gaza, and certainly Palestinians cannot travel out of Gaza. This is a very important thing to keep in mind. It is extremely hard, if not impossible, for Palestinian people to exit Gaza. Through the Erez crossing, it's almost impossible. Most of the time, when it's possible, it's through the south. You can see there the Rafah crossing into Egypt. Even that is extremely difficult because the border is closed most of the time, and there are all kinds of bureaucratic barriers that prohibit people from leaving Gaza. So for all intents and purposes, I think we need to think about Gaza as a prison. It's usually called the world's largest open air prison, and there are more than 2 million people living in there now. It's a very small area. The red line that you can see around Gaza, that is the line, the border between Gaza and Israel. And it's heavily policed and militarized by the Israeli military. I don't want to call it the Israeli Defense Force. It's really an aggressive force more than anything else. You can see the Mediterranean Sea is also heavily policed, where people from Gaza cannot venture more than a certain number of kilometers. It would be prohibited by Israel for them to do so. So to all intents and purposes, Gaza is a highly militarized, contained, prison-like environment for people. Now you need to think about that. What does it do to people, to children growing up, when they live under these conditions of lack of safety, of being constrained, of being confined? Okay, so this is how one enters Gaza. This is through the Erez crossing now. And you can see the bottom left picture is a corridor, a passageway that is fenced in. And you have to walk this long kilometer down, and there are these buggies that people also use to get to the other side from Israel into Gaza, and going through the three sets of officials. So in 2016, I went to a conference in Gaza. It was one of those very rare occasions where people from the international community were allowed to travel into Gaza to attend this conference on mental health and human rights. And I gave a talk on some of my work in South Africa, because I'd been doing some work with former political detainees in South Africa, and thinking through issues related to trauma and post-traumatic stress, and how former political detainees in South Africa were being integrated into the post-apartheid negotiated settlement, etc. So I attended this conference to present some of my work, and I got speaking to some of the colleagues there at the center, and we spoke about ways in which we can think through some of the common issues between South Africa and Palestine, in terms of both having a history of oppression, of repression, of trauma, of psychological distress among communities, etc. And these were some of the places that I was taken to. You can see a lot of the walls have holes in them. These are bullet holes. These are bullet holes. People were living there when the Israeli military shot at them, shot at civilians. And you can see the bullet holes in the buildings, in the homes of people, in the apartments and the flats. And this is the consequence of, this was a consequence of actually the 2014 aggression of Israel into Palestine. It is devastating. And you can imagine what it must be like being on the receiving end of this kind of aggression. The trauma, the fear, the anguish, the psychological suffering that men, women, and children endure as a consequence of this kind of aggression. These are some of the pictures that were on the walls of the Gaza Community Mental Health Center that were made by the children. They were doing play therapy, and you can see it's pretty disturbing pictures that they, works of art that these children were making. The thinking at the time, and this is several years ago now, was that doing this kind of art was in some way psychologically helpful for people. Now, this is obviously a contested matter, and I'll come to some of the issues related to the evidence for mental health interventions. But anyway, this is the kind of thing that that the kids were producing in the play therapy, in the art therapy, in the kinds of interventions that were being presented to them. So let me talk a little bit about what it's like. It's extremely densely populated. It's very dry. It's dusty. It is hugely under-resourced. There are more than 2 million people living in this very confined area, and most people are poor. People live under conditions of deep poverty. They live under siege, and the siege has been imposed for now probably about 15 years, where the borders have been sealed so that nobody can go out, and it's very difficult for people to come in. Israelis controlled access in the north, as I mentioned, and the Egyptians control access in the south. And there are restrictions in terms of what can be imported and exported. There are restrictions in terms of food, medical supplies, fuel, water, electricity, and it is not uncommon to have no electricity for several hours. Now, I know in this country we complain when we have load shedding, and we should complain, we must complain. In the context of Gaza, electricity is deliberately cut off by Israel because they can, because they have the power to do so. What I've also been told is that people in Gaza, some of the small farmers produce produce like olives, for example, for export. And there are ways in which they can export it through certain ways through Israel. But what happens is that the Israeli officials let the olives and other produce sit there for a few days so that it rots and is no longer sellable, no longer usable, and as a consequence of that, these products don't get sold and don't get exported. So there's all kinds of ways. There are all kinds of ways in which Israel makes life extremely difficult for people in Gaza. They know, Israel knows that a complete embargo, if they seal the place altogether and don't allow any food in, that there'll be starvation and famine. And that will in turn provoke an international outcry. So they allow only enough food and resources in so that people can survive. In fact, there's one infamous quote by one Israeli general, which is, he said, the idea is to put the Palestinians on a diet, but not to make them die of hunger. Because to die of hunger would then provoke another crisis that Israel doesn't want to deal with. So they restrict the amount of food and goods that come in so that people can just about survive. Okay, so that's a picture at the bottom there of kids on the beach. That's the Mediterranean Sea in the background. Okay, all right. So the siege has devastated the local economy. Very few people have jobs. There are various international NGOs that provide humanitarian aid. Businesses don't do very well because people don't have much money. A lot of the students have told me that they like to study English because they can sometimes find work as translators or tutors to young children, or work in NGOs, and there are various NGOs that are active there. But the overwhelming majority of people are unemployed. But there are universities, and so the universities have students, and the students do graduate, but they graduate with no job that they can go into. So they stay home, they have nothing to occupy themselves with, they have no income. So psychologically, there are things that happen as a consequence of this: hopelessness, apathy, depression, poor self-worth, a bleak view of the future. If someone who is 18, 20, 22, if a person at that age doesn't have a sense of what the future holds, that the future actually is not going to be anything of substance for them, this is a matter of hopelessness that a lot of people in Gaza experience. All right, so in addition to the siege, of course, there are these attacks, right? You can call them wars, but they're not actually wars, because a war means that the two parties who are fighting each other are equal in strength, and that's not the case here. The people living in Gaza are defenseless against the Israeli military, who have very sophisticated military hardware to perpetrate the aggressive acts. And the Israeli military does not discriminate between militants and the non-combatants, the ordinary men and women and children who are in communities who do not take up arms against Israel. So there are lots and lots of people, many of them young children and youths, who live with amputations, who live with spinal cord injury, who live with traumatic brain injury. They have scars, they have wounds caused by these Israeli rocket attacks. In a sense, there's no real place of safety in Gaza when there's an offensive campaign by Israel. There's nowhere for people to run. I mean, I know several people at the center where I've been active who have lost many family members. People have lost their brothers and sisters and children and nephews and nieces, etc. So it is very common for people in Gaza to be able to talk to people about the number of people that they've lost in these military attacks. Israel has also used incendiary explosives that contain white phosphorus that cause deep third-degree burns in the skin, and these damage the vital organs, and they even cause death under certain circumstances. But the long-term effects are cognitive deficits and learning problems, so that the kids who do survive these attacks face difficulties at school and work. And I've been told, for example, of young children, 5, 6 years old, who don't know how dangerous white phosphorus is. And so they pick it up and they carry it in their pocket. And of course, it is hugely dangerous in terms of the burns that they suffer and these psychological effects, the cognitive effects that they have. So somebody born in 2008 would have survived 3 wars, 2008, 2012, and 2014. And of course, the various attacks that you read about in the newspaper and you see on TV that have occurred since. These happen all the time. So these are a couple of pictures of the Islamic University of Gaza. I was taken to see the damage that was caused by the 2014 attacks, and they were in the process of rebuilding with the assistance of outside governments such as Qatar and Turkey. Those are some of the governments that have provided some funds to do restoration on some of the buildings. But you can imagine if people's homes are destroyed, if their schools are destroyed, if the clinics are destroyed, what the effect this has on people when communities are disrupted. And so psychologically, in addition to the physical harm, the physical danger, there's depression, there's anxiety, there's trauma. When people lose loved ones, there's grief and hopelessness. And what in the work that I've been doing with the community center, what has emerged now is suicide, which has been a very taboo topic, you know, in almost all Muslim communities. Suicide is not a thing that people will admit to, or it's very difficult to get information about this. And it's historically been a very rare event in Gaza, but this is now happening. There are young people, especially young men, who have made suicide attempts. And this is a matter of deep concern for the GCMHP, which is the Gaza Community Mental Health Program. There is no end in sight to the siege. There's no escape from what is essentially an extremely difficult life. And a lot of the young people that I've spoken to want to leave. They want to go and live somewhere else. And I said to them, to one young person, where would you like to go? And she said, anywhere, doesn't matter, as long as it's not here, because the conditions are so difficult. One of the other things that has been observed by the GCMHP, the program, the Community Mental Health Program, is substance use. Now, there's no alcohol in Gaza that I know of, and everyone I've spoken to assures me that alcohol is not available. But what is available are other substances. Tramadol, specifically, appears to have made its way into communities. It's an opioid, it's snorted, and produces an immediate euphoric high, a feeling of pleasure or happiness. And of course, it has very devastating effects. It debilitates youth in terms of their functioning, their well-being, etc. It is a serious community problem. What is also available is hashish and MDMA. And the way I understand it, what has been told to me is that these things get smuggled through the tunnels from Israel and also brought in through Egypt. Alcohol, though, is not available. So what does this mean for people's mental health? It means very, very bad things. Parents, children, adolescents experience constant fear, anxiety, anger. There's a sense of helplessness, but this helplessness is also becomes anger, because there's a sense that there's a sense of huge injustice, and people want to retaliate against what Israel is doing, but they are obviously not able to do so. The coping resources are limited, and so what happens is, in a lot of communities, there's community violence, there's school violence, there's family dysfunction, and it's a constant sense of humiliation and degradation that people feel on a day-to-day basis. I guess one way of thinking about this is what was like to be living in a very poor community during apartheid, where the Caspers were going through the townships, etc., and the apartheid government had the military might, and people in communities had no power at all. But many people have said, and I think I agree with this, that the situation in Palestine, in Gaza, is worse than apartheid. The men usually assume the role of the breadwinner in the family, and if they can't find work, it is quite debilitating for them in their sense of value, being unable to take care of their families, because truly there's very little work, there are very little opportunities for employment. And parents are, of course, affected by their inability to protect their children from harm. And as a consequence of this, a lot of the parents have difficulties coping. Some men resort to domestic violence, paradoxically, and one hears accounts of these kinds of things in the context of their frustration and constant humiliation, their inability to do anything about the situation. So there's violence against children, against women, and also community violence and school violence. These are the NGOs that provide services in the context of Gaza. They provide primary and vocational education, they provide healthcare, social services, infrastructure and camp improvement, microfinance where that's available, and emergency response in the case of an attack from Israel. So in the context of this very difficult environment, very difficult set of circumstances, where there's a huge public mental health burden, where there's huge distress, trauma, depression, substance use, anxiety, fear, and a whole range of other mental health conditions, the Gaza Community Mental Health Program was started some years ago. And the picture at the bottom is of a man whose name I'm sure some of you might know. His name is Iyad Sarraj, and he was the founder of the Gaza Community Mental Health Program, a public figure, a psychiatrist, and an activist. The picture of the person at the top is Yasser Abu Jamai, and Yasser is the current director of the organization, of the NGO. So this NGO provides mental health services. They provide psychological services to men, women, and children, survivors of violence, torture, and human rights violations. It's a very large NGO. There are over 135 employees, and they have a network with other international, regional, and local coalitions and networks. And they've treated thousands and thousands of clients over the past several years. So they offer psychotherapy and counseling. They offer anonymous telephone counseling, and the anonymity is actually quite an important thing in this context, because there's a huge amount of stigma associated with having a mental health condition. There's a huge amount of stigma, and as a consequence, a lot of people are inhibited to actually seek mental health services. And because they're inhibited to seek mental health services, there's a huge need that goes unmet, even though there are services available. So the anonymous telephone counseling plays an important role. The center provides crisis intervention, rehabilitation, and also other kinds of interventions, non-psychological, occupational therapy, and physical therapy. It's also a place of social inclusion for youth, including people who are apolitical or are not associated with religious groups. They do school mediation to reduce the level of school violence and to educate children in peaceful ways to engage in conflict resolution. They have summer camps. Of course, the camps are within Gaza because they can't travel out. And they petition for permission in extreme cases when people need to seek medical treatment in Israel and coordinate with Israeli human rights groups. A big partner of GCMHP is Physicians for Human Rights, which is quite an important, influential body. So when one provides mental health services in Gaza, stigma is, as I mentioned, an important thing to keep in mind. There's this idea among some people in communities about the idea of madness, that only mad people need to attend a mental health center, and I'm using that term in quotations. Some people would rather not be seen to be acknowledging that they have a mental health problem. They just think it's not an acceptable thing. And for other people, mental illness or mental health condition is seen by some as an affliction from God and is best dealt with by traditional healers, religious healers, rather than psychologists and psychiatrists. I actually was taken to meet a Hakim on one occasion, who provides traditional healing in the context of Gaza. Needless to say, war and the trauma of war has placed a huge strain on families, on men, women, children, communities, and they struggle to survive. So when I spoke to my colleagues at the GCMHP in 2016, I said, well, what can an outsider do? What can I do coming from South Africa, being based at a university in South Africa? I'm very concerned about how I can be helpful without wanting to be intrusive. And they said, well, we need two things. We need training of our psychologists in interventions that they are lacking in, where the skills base is lacking. That's the one thing. And I said, well, I'm very much in favor of evidence-informed psychological practice. I do a lot of research, and my emphasis is very much on empirically supported treatments, and maybe this is something I can help with. The other thing they told me was we need to do research in Gaza because we don't have data. And because we don't have data, it's very difficult for us to know what is needed in communities and how we can deploy resources most optimally to ensure that the efforts that we make meet the needs of people in communities. So how about helping us with research capacity? And I said, yes, absolutely, I can do this. So let me tell you about these two things that I've been involved with. The first is clinical training, and I'll talk a little bit more about specifically the kinds of things that I've been doing. But cognitive psychotherapy, CBT, cognitive behavior therapy, it happens to be an area that I have some training in. I did a postdoctoral fellowship at the University of Pennsylvania, which is where cognitive therapy originated, where Aaron Beck used to work until he passed away recently. And I've been trained at the Beck Institute, and so I can do training in cognitive therapy in the same way that I train my students at Stellenbosch University. Cognitive therapy specifically for specific mental health conditions: major depressive disorder, generalized anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder, obsessive compulsive disorder, and somatic symptom disorders. Now, you would think that the most common mental health condition in Gaza would be post-traumatic stress disorder. And that is true. There's a huge amount of trauma. There's a huge amount of post-traumatic stress. But there are also other things that people experience. There's a huge amount of mood disturbance and other conditions that people have. And of course, there's comorbidity. I mentioned substance use. There's comorbidity with the mental health condition and substance use, and many people also have more than one psychological condition. And so, of course, one has to tailor one's efforts to intervene in such a way that that these needs are being met. So I'll talk a bit more about that in a little bit, but let me tell you a little bit about some of my concerns about my role as a researcher. The concern that I have was that one can't do tourist research here. You can't go in and collect data and leave. This is improper. It's unethical. It is not good practice to be able to do this. I didn't want to be in a situation where I was going to conduct my own research with little involvement of local researchers, and then nothing actually changes on the ground in communities, and it's of very little benefit or no benefit to local people. And I might get publications out of it. I can talk about it at conferences, etc. But this is not. One has to be very careful about how one goes about working with colleagues and in communities if one is an outsider, if one is not part of that community. So the issue here is how to build research capacity. So part of what I do at Stellenbosch University is that I teach research methodology as well. It's one of my pet subjects. And I did several training workshops, numerous over the years, training workshops in research methods, in measurement, in psychometrics, in designing an intervention study, a trial, qualitative research, how to do qualitative interviews, how to do focus groups. All of those things over the past few years, I've been doing this kind of training. The second thing, and this is a bit difficult, is assisting with the development of research proposals. Because there has been very little capacity in English academic writing, because everybody speaks Arabic and many people do speak English, but they seldom write in English. And certainly writing academic English is a skill that many people don't possess. And so when I assisted with the development of research proposal, it was very time intensive, very resource intensive. I'd have to spend a lot of time, even before you get writing, sitting and listening to what the research question is. What are you trying to answer? What are you trying to do in this particular project? In order to get some of these research projects off the ground. And then training in research ethics, because in Gaza, there's no such thing as an ethics committee. Historically, people just collected data without it being approved by an ethics committee. So talking to the colleagues about ethical reasoning, how to proceed with writing a research proposal and thinking through the ethical aspects, and then also ensuring that there's ethical oversight of this project that we work through. So with the successful proposals, what we did is that we needed an internationally accredited ethics committee, and we used Stellenbosch University's Health Research Ethics Committee for ethical clearance of research projects. For that to happen, what I needed to do was appoint some colleagues as research associates at Stellenbosch University, and I petitioned my university, my institution, to have a few colleagues appointed as research associates. So the director and the director of research, the director of the training program have been appointed as associates at my university so that they can have access to the ethics committee. Also importantly, access to journals from the university's electronic library. So this is what I mean by capacity building, by creating conditions for skills to be acquired in the context of the GCMHP. So we did a priority setting exercise, and again, I wanted to be very careful not to impose my own thoughts and my own ideas, but to sit back and listen to what people had to say in terms of what are the priorities, what needs to be done here in the context of research. And so these are some of the things that we came up with in the context of the priority setting exercise. Studying the prevalence of suicide ideation and attempts. What are the things that predict suicidal behavior? How do you prevent drug use and intervene early with abusers? What is the effect of psychological interventions to manage things like post-traumatic stress, depression, anxiety, substance use, family violence, school bullying, etc.? How can one evaluate the effects of the siege on the population in terms of hopelessness, humiliation, living under resource constrained circumstances, living with things like limited electricity, poor infrastructure, etc. Now, we can't obviously answer all of these questions. It's a long process to be able to do this, and we need a whole range of different people involved, not only psychologists, but also anthropologists, sociologists, historians, political scientists, journalists, etc., in order to be able to address some of these things. So we've produced a whole range of papers, and these are some of them. They are actually available, at least the abstracts are available on Google Scholar. And if you want any of these papers, I'm happy to send it to you. Let me just go through them. Doing community work in the ongoing crisis, and how to integrate a public health approach and a human rights approach, and how to make these two things happen. Because a public health approach focuses on primary, secondary, and tertiary levels of intervention, and a human rights approach focuses on things related to oppression, injustice, and human rights. And so bringing those two narratives together is what we did in this paper. We did a paper on risk and protective factors on tramadol abuse, and we interviewed tramadol users and also psychiatrists, the people who see these service users. We did a study among university students on suicide behavior, and it was an exploratory study, so we could get some data on this. We did a study that was published in Global Mental Health, Living Under Siege, Resilience, Hopelessness, and Psychological Distress. Now, let me say a quick word about resilience, because it's a term that I use a little bit skeptically, because sometimes resilience can give the sense that, you know, all you need as an individual is to be resilient, and you'll be able to withstand all of these social, political, military assaults. And, you know, if you have enough resilience, you'll be okay. And of course, that's not the case. The emphasis very much is on the context, on the political context, on the military context, on the attacks that Gaza experiences. We did a paper on the concerns that people have in the context of political oppression and how mental health providers perceive these concerns of people. And we looked at social support and the effects of siege among university students. So let me just talk in a bit more detail about this one paper, which I thought was maybe something I could talk a little bit about. The interplay of paradigms, decolonizing a psychology curriculum in the context of Gaza. And this paper was published in Nordic Psychology. And it essentially framed Gaza as a colonial context and focuses on decolonizing the pedagogy of psychology in the context of political violence. And there are three things to keep in mind with this paper. One is an ideological point, that instead of psychological services being used to make people adapt to and become familiar with, become used to an oppressive social context, the issue here was using psychological services as an arena of resistance to oppression, that psychological treatment, counseling, psychotherapy, etc., can actually be a way of resistance, of managing the situation. The second point is theoretical, that individual change and the amelioration of psychological symptoms is possible even under the most oppressive conditions, including war and perpetual conflict, and to look for a role for psychology to help people negotiate their life circumstances so that they can derive meaning under conditions of extreme oppression. And then the third point is practical. What do you actually do? Advocacy, media, school programs, psychological first aid, telephone counseling, individual and family therapeutic services, etc. And the paper essentially looks to create a dialogue between logical positivism or post-positivism and constructionist, social constructivist approaches. My emphasis has always been that empirical claims that one makes in psychology need to be backed up by data, need to be supported by data. So when you make a claim that a certain kind of psychological treatment is effective, my question is, how do you know? What are the data to support your claim? And if you say that psychological states such as mood disturbance and traumatization can be ameliorated by psychological treatments, we need the data to support that. The other view, or not necessarily an oppositional view, but another narrative would be a social constructionist approach that wants to critique and deconstruct diagnostic categories and taxonomies using hermeneutic interpretations of mental diagnosis and pathologies. So the paper actually looks at ways in which we can bring these two paradigms together in the context of decoloniality in Gaza. So this is what I've been doing. The paper talks about two sets of interventions. One is cognitive psychotherapy, and this is the workshop that I fashioned and presented several times now, actually, over the years in Gaza. And what we do is upfront lectures, small group discussions, role play, question and answer sessions. And then my colleague, whose name is Guido from the University of Milan, Guido Veronese, he does family therapy, and he comes at this very much from a social constructionist point of view and focuses on good parenting and social integration in the family, parental education, and religious commitment that can buffer children, and places centrality of the family structure and tight relations in providing children with opportunities to trust others and learn how to endure adversities and share experiences of mastery. Again, not that easy in the context of Gaza, but this is what we try to do. And essentially teaching the canon of cognitive psychotherapy and family therapy requires that they be implemented in a manual-based way. We're teaching people how to do this, and so therefore we need to, in our view, stick to some kind of a manual, which of course comes with its own ideological context of pedagogical coloniality and hegemonic control. But what we think we're trying to do is increase the skill level of clinicians, which will ultimately result in client improvement, in amelioration of symptoms among the patients who seek services as at the mental health center. So pedagogical hegemony can be used to achieve positive client outcomes in the form of a reduction in psychological distress and symptomatology. All right, so you can see here some pictures of the seminars, the workshops, the stuff that we do. It's a place of study, it's a place of scholarship, it's a place of engagement with ideas. It's a place where we try to take what we know from other contexts, things that have been shown to be effective in the Euro-American context, in the South African context, elsewhere, and look at ways in which can it fit in the context of Gaza? Can it work? What do we need to do to make it work in the context of this place where many people have essentially forgotten that Gaza exists because it's such a small place, but we need to keep the story alive. So what are the challenges? And I'm nearly done with the talk. What are the challenges? Well, inconsistent electricity and internet. Over lockdown and COVID, I've been doing lots and lots of these workshops on Zoom, and the internet goes out, the electricity goes out. I'm on Zoom with groups of people in 3 different places in Gaza. My English gets translated into Arabic, and it gets presented in Arabic, and then somebody asks a question which needs to be translated into English again. Limited ability to travel. Before COVID, I've been going about twice a year, and I'm scheduled to go in the next week or 2. I'm waiting for a permit to be able to travel, and the challenges of getting a permit, actually getting through the different checkpoints, the metal detectors, etc. English language, academic writing is a constant challenge, and this is something that I've been trying to assist with. And then political challenges. The authorities are suspicious of research. Some of the work that we wanted to do at Shifa Hospital in Gaza on talking to people who had made suicide attempts, that got stopped because the authorities didn't want this kind of research being done. So we weren't able to collect those data. That's what I got. That's the end of my talk. I hope I haven't overstepped my time. Thank you, everybody.
That was great. Shukran so much, Ashraf. We're open now for questions and comments. So for all the attendees, please do pop those in the chat. I wonder, Ashraf, if I can begin with a question. In settings like these, practitioners will often wonder about, of course, care for the carers.
Yeah.
And the question that comes to mind for me is, when you engage with these mental health practitioners at the GCMHP, I'm thinking of the fact that they've seen tens of thousands of clients over the years. There's a grimness about the work that they do in the face of an ongoing assault on so many fronts from the Israeli state. How do the mental health practitioners feel about the work that they do? What is their morale like? I'm not sure if that is something that you might be able to comment on.
I can comment on it. Look, it varies. It's an interesting question about whether you can make a distinction between a clinician and a service user in the context of Gaza, because a lot of the clinicians at the GCMHP have actually lost family members themselves. They have experienced grief themselves. They have post-traumatic stress themselves. Many might have a mood disturbance themselves. So it's a very difficult thing to distinguish between are you only a clinician, or do you yourself require mental health services? And the organization does have a self-care kind of philosophy where there's a great emphasis on people attending to their own needs, their own mental health needs, etc. there are various ways in which the management of the organization looks at ways in which they can be supportive of the clinicians. There is burnout. There is a lot of distress that clinicians have as a consequence of working with this many clients. Also, I think the fact that we speak about the social determinants of mental health. Where does a mental health condition come from? Does it come from within the person, or does it come from the context where people live? In the context of Gaza, it's very easy to make the case that it is because Gaza is what it is, because it's being attacked by Israel so regularly, because it is an open-air prison, that mental health conditions arise as a consequence of these phenomena. And so the question for clinicians is, how do you stop the root cause? And there's no answer to that question. The root cause is political, it's military, it's historical. And so what clinicians can do and have to do under the circumstances is look at ways in which they can take the situation that is seemingly hopeless and try to work with clients to make their lives in some way functional, because life needs to go on.
Thanks, Ashraf. I'm seeing a couple of questions popping up in the chat now. Let me begin with one question from Jane Marie, who asks, have there been efforts to integrate or apply an Islamic worldview or Islamic psychology in community mental health? If yes, have there been studies checking its effectiveness?
So the second
Ashraf,
part
any
of the
thoughts on that?
question, the second part of the question, I think I know the answer to. There have not been any studies checking its effectiveness. And if there are, it would be in the literature. As far as I know, the literature reviews that I've done and that my colleagues have done have not yielded any studies of that nature. Now, I mentioned earlier that there is some there are communities where there are traditional healers, faith healers, hakims, etc. As far as I know, and from my conversations with the clinicians, it has not been integrated. It has not been integrated, although everybody's religious, everybody makes salah, everybody observes the 5 pillars of Islam. So in fact, actually, most people are Muslim, but there are some Christians as well who live in Gaza, and I've met them. But I would say 95% of people in Gaza are Muslim. I don't know the exact percentage, but it's a predominantly Muslim place. So Islam plays an important role in helping people cope, helping people manage their daily lives. And there are mosques that are very full most of the time. So Islam is practiced. I don't know about the extent to which Islamic psychology as a discipline and field of practice has been integrated into the psychological interventions. And that has not been something that I've done. I've been teaching CBT in its pure form, because that is what I know, and that is what the empirical evidence suggests is most effective. But I think it's a good question, and maybe it's something that I need to think about, and my colleagues in Gaza need to think about also.
Thanks again, Ashraf. I'm just seeing another question relating to the earlier one about an Islamic psych worldview. Might its integration not assist with the destigmatization of mental health issues in the community? If users can see that there's an Islamic worldview that is being brought to bear on mental health services, that might make them more, I suppose, religiously or culturally accessible and acceptable in a way.
Yeah, so that is certainly a plausible question, and it's something that we'll think about, and I'll certainly take it back to my colleagues. a colleague of mine in my department, Mariam, is doing a study in South Africa actually on explanatory models of mental health conditions among Muslims, and she's interviewing Muslim religious leaders, Muslim psychologists, Muslim service users in order to understand how Muslim people make sense of mental health conditions. So the data that we collect in South Africa may indeed be very helpful in informing some of this work as well.
Absolutely. To the audience, please keep your questions coming. Ashraf, another sort of, I mean, I'm almost freestyling here. Perhaps it's part question, part comment, but thinking about what you were referring to at various points in your presentation around hopelessness and terminal thinking, essentially, and of course the increasing prevalence of increasing rates of suicide, and of course increased substance use. And so when I put all of that together, it seems to me as if the question of hope is really essential as far as people's mental health goes in Gaza. And of course, this conflict has now been going on for decades. And I'm just thinking of that series of maps that you showed, dating back to 1917. It almost tells the story of a growing hopelessness, in a sense. And I wonder, on the ground, what's your reading of the situation amongst the Gazans? I mean, of course, many of them will feel hopeless about the situation, given where the international consensus seems to be, so much support for the Israeli state, and so much fear, really, about taking on the Israeli state in the form of sanctions and so on. But if you look at the Gazan community, are there still pockets of hope? Do people still believe that there is light at the end of the tunnel, as it were? I know that's a difficult question to answer, but what's your reading of that?
So maybe the way to think about this is to call attention to how people cope, firstly, and how people cope is with a whole range of different things. Religion plays a hugely important role in helping people get through their days, in helping people manage the constant challenges. So the faith in God is almost unanimous, etc. And then performing prayers, etc. Family plays a hugely important role, both not only nuclear family but extended family. This is a very important way in which people cope, manage their lives, manage to get through their days, etc. Focusing on education in the absence of jobs. So people go to school, they go to university, etc. IUG, Islamic University of Gaza, is a quite a thriving place, actually, but there are also some other universities as well. And then, you know, I drove through Gaza with colleagues and friends, etc., and we're driving around, and all of a sudden you hear cheering and people clearly having a very good time, and they're like, "What is this? What's going on?" It's a wedding. Weddings happen all the time. There are weddings all the time, and very soon after, because there's nothing else to do, so when people are 18, 19, 20 years old, they get married. And very shortly after that, they have a few children, you know. And historically, families in Gaza have been very large, like 8 or 9 children in a family. My understanding is that that numbers now become smaller. People are having smaller families just because of the financial constraints of having large families. So you know, I think people cope and manage things in different ways. I mentioned to you the fact that I spoke to a couple of people, and some of the young people, they want to leave. They don't see any way forward in this place. And where do you want to go? Anyway. So there is that sense of there's no political solution, there's no military solution. This is just going to carry on for generations in the future. So some people do have that view, and then others try to manage it as best they can under the circumstances in which they find themselves.
Ashraf, I see a few more questions coming through here from Sumaya Khan. How possible is it for English-speaking psychologists to get involved in the mental health projects in the communities, taking into consideration the language barrier that you spoke about?
So I don't speak Arabic myself, but many people at the GCMHP do speak English, and I communicate with them perfectly. They speak perfect English. There's some that don't, and when I've done my workshops, there's usually a translator there. So if that is of interest to you, I mean, I'm sure things like providing supervision and support to psychologists through online means would be something that my colleagues at the GCMHP would welcome. And so if anybody would like to assist with that, I think I can play a role in linking you up with colleagues there.
Right. Okay, here's another question from Zubaida Dangor. Has any work been done on violence against women and children? I assume she means in the Gazan context.
Yeah, it depends on what you mean by work. Certainly clinical work. There are people that come to the NGO for assistance with interventions where there's family violence, spouse abuse, specifically violence against children, and the clinicians, the counselors, the psychologists have been working with women and children for the past many years in this regard. And to be quite frank, there is violence against women and children perpetrated by Palestinian men. And of course, I mentioned in a context that is this difficult, where there's this level of unemployment, desperation, it's not unlikely that it takes its strain on families. And so there's certainly clinical work on this.
And of course, the connection between shame and violence, shame, humiliation, and violence is very well established.
Right.
I see a comment also here from Rehana Sidat. There's research that has shown that with the use of EMDR, resilience can be created in Palestine. A question, I think, is from Sister Shireen. Could Professor tell us a little more about the suicide paper? What does it mean for the youth in the future?
Yeah, so essentially what it means is that firstly, we need to be aware that people have suicidal thoughts, that people have suicidal ideation. We need to be aware that some people may make suicide attempts, and some people, a minority though, may complete suicide, may actually take their own life. This has come to the attention of the GCMHP anecdotally. So the question is how to firstly identify ways in which we can intervene by creating conditions where people who have suicidal thoughts can come forward and say, look, I'm having these feelings, these thoughts, these intentions. They are disturbing me. I need help. I need assistance. To be able to destigmatize the notion of having suicidal thoughts, because a lot of people think that it's a terrible sin and they'll go to hell if they speak the word, if they confess to somebody else. And so rethinking that, thinking about ways in which one can engage with people with compassion, with understanding, and with support in order to offset the likelihood of them actually making a suicide attempt. I read a very interesting thing in a, I think it was an article in a magazine about when you say that someone commits suicide. Commit is an active word it's like you're actually doing something. You commit. If you say you're committing murder, you're doing it. You have volition. You're doing it deliberately. If you think about a suicide attempt as a symptom of a mental health condition like mood disturbance, major depression, the volitional aspect of it is not really what's driving the thing. It is the mental health condition that is playing itself out in the form of a symptom, and a suicide thought, a suicide intention, a suicide attempt is an expression of that mental health condition. So to say that someone commits suicide is maybe not the best way of framing it, you know. So I've now stopped using the term committing suicide. You know, someone makes an attempt on their life, someone tries to take their own life, which is different from saying that they're committing it as in an act of volition.
I'm seeing another comment from Sumaya
Yeah,
Khan.
death by suicide. Yeah, someone said that.
Okay, all right. Sumaya Khan saying, I would love to be involved. We did communicate about 2 years ago, wasn't able to follow through due to COVID restrictions. She will get in touch with you again, Ashraf.
Yeah, look, I speak to
yeah.
my colleagues in Gaza all the time, so I can put you in touch with the director of training and the director of research with, you know, if you have those skills and would like to be involved in some way, producing material, supervising psychologists, sharing, doing a workshop, etc. These days with the technology, you know, it's quite doable.
Right. I can see a lot of members of the audience are wanting to assist and get involved. How can one get involved? Zubaida asks, how does one get in touch? Well, I guess, Ashraf, the best thing would be just for interested parties to email you.
Yeah, absolutely. That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm going to write my email in the chat here.
Great. Super. Another comment from Jane Marie. Thank you for your response, dear Prof. I think another area that might be nice to explore is taking advantage of the strength of religion, not just to address mental health stigma and to promote the adoption of adaptive coping strategies, but to put pressure on families, community members, and leaders, and even government agencies to work on mental and HR issues in an integrated way through psychoeducation, PFA, social, emotional, and ethical learning from an Islamic worldview. Comment there from Jane Marie.
Yeah, good point. Look, I'm sure some of it is being done, not necessarily by me, but if you have ideas on how to make this work, you know, by all means, let me know, and I'll convey you know, your ideas to my colleagues there, and even put you in touch with people. So yeah, absolutely.
I'm just monitoring. I think we pretty much. Yeah, Ashraf.
The one thing I mentioned kind of at the beginning was, you know, I'm responding to an expressed need that was communicated to me by my colleagues a few years ago, and so my job is to listen very carefully to think about ways in which I can meet the needs without necessarily imposing my own specific agenda, you know. And I do feel the need to kind of be careful about that, because one can easily reproduce a situation of power, you know, and say, look, here's what I think, and here's what needs to be done, and this is what we're doing, and that is exactly not what I want to do. So a lot of it is negotiating.
Yeah, I'm just thinking of how you framed your intervention here, Ashraf, as essentially around building capacity, training people to use evidence-based practices when sitting with clients, and then also building research skills so that members of the community can conduct the kinds of research that they believe is relevant for their purposes. I don't see anything new coming up in the chat, but we are coming up to 10 to 9 anyway. Okay, so in the absence of any further comments or questions? Ashraf, I feel that I want to thank you in different ways here. I mean, firstly, obviously for your presentation and giving us a ground up perspective on what's going on in Gaza, not only materially and politically and economically, but particularly from the psychological perspective. And then also to thank you for clearly the incredible work you're doing in helping our brothers and sisters in Gaza in the way that you are. And then thirdly, just to ask that you convey all our salams and our best wishes and our du'as to the people of Gaza when you get there again in the coming weeks. Inshallah, we wish you safe travels and continued strength in your efforts to build capacity, clinical capacity and research capacity among the people and the mental health professionals in Gaza. Thank you so much for your time tonight, Ashraf. And to the members of the audience, please do fill out the feedback forms, and don't forget about that upcoming event. I think it was in late November, inshallah, a psychological perspective on the challenges that young Muslims face when studying Hifz al-Quran. So on that note, I will bring things to an end. Subhanakallahumma wa bihamdik, ashhadu an la ilaha إلا أنت أستغفرك وأتوب إليك. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله تعالى وبركاته. Shukran to all the members of the audience for attending, and have a pleasant evening or rest of the day wherever you are in the world right now. Some nice comments coming through there also from the audience. Ashraf, thank you again very much for your time and spending this evening with us tonight.
Thank you so much, Wahbi, and to everybody who attended. Assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum salam.